Submitting transactions. In order to submit transactions for processing, you need to have knowledge of multiple classes. In this lecture, I'll touch on all of those classes for submitting transactions. I'll talk about the factory. A factory can be used for creating new resource instances. Then I'll show you how to get access to the factory by using the business network connection and the business network definition. I'll also introduce you to the resource class that represents a resource instance of the type that has been defined in the model. In this lecture, I'll be referring to the code available in bn-factory-submit-transaction.js file. The function getBusinessNetwork can be used for pulling information about the application from the runtime. When you invoke this function, you would receive an instance of the business network definition class. In the lecture on admin connection, I introduced you to the business network definition class. There I talked about how you could create the instance of business network definition by reading an archive or by reading the model project from a directory. Now I'll talk about how you can use the business network definition for getting access to the resource factory. You can invoke the get factory on the business network definition that you have retrieved from the runtime, and this function would return an instance of a factory. And this factory object can be used for creating instances of resources that have been defined in the business network application. There are 5 functions available on the factory class. The first one is the new resource that takes the namespace, the type, and the identifier that will be assigned to the new resource instance. This leads to a creation of an instance of the class resource, which is available in the common module. The next function is the new concept that takes the namespace and the type of the concept defined in the business network application. This leads to a creation of an instance of the class concept. The concept class is available under the common module. Next function is the new relationship that takes the namespace, the type, and the identifier. This function creates an instance of the relationship class that is available under the common module. The relationship class represents a pointer to the resource identified by the identifier. And this relationship instance can be assigned to a field which is a relationship field. The new event function takes the namespace, the type, ID of the event, which is optional, and some options, and creates an instance of the resource of type event. The fifth function is the new transaction that takes the namespace, the type, an identifier, and the options. Call to this function creates an instance of the resource class with the type equal to transaction. Now this transaction can be submitted for processing using the instance of business network connection, which is already connected to the runtime. And to do that, you can use the function submit transaction with the transaction object created with the new transaction function. Next, the resource class is available under the common module. It represents a resource instance that has type. Type here refers to the resource definitions created as part of the model. For example, in the case of Acme airline model, we have defined an aircraft type asset and the flight type asset. And we have also defined a transaction create flight. So create flight is the type of a resource. Instance of the create flight can be created by using the factory.newTransaction method. The properties in the create flight transaction can be changed by using the method setPropertyValue and providing it a property name and property value. There are many other functions in the resource class, and I will cover those in the next lecture. In this code walkthrough, you would learn how to use the business network connection and the factory class for submitting a transaction. I'll be submitting the create flight transaction for the airline V7. There are 6 steps involved. We'll use the BN connection util to create the connection to airline V7. Then we'll get the business network definition from the runtime using the get business definition. And then we'll get the factory from the business network definition. We'll create a new transaction instance by invoking the new transaction function on the factory, and then we'll set the property values on the transaction object. And then we'll call the submit transaction function on the business network connection. First, we are setting the namespace variable, which is set to org.acme.airline.flight, and we are setting the transaction type to create flight. As a step 1, we are connecting to the airline V7 and passing the main function as a callback function. In the main function, if there is no error, then we go ahead and invoke the get business network on the connection object. A message is printed on the console with the name of the business network definition and the version of the business network definition received from the runtime. Then we call the get factory on the business network definition. In the fourth step, we have to create an instance of new transaction. And to do that, we have to pass some options. These options are very well documented in the Fabric documentation. I suggest that you take a look at it. Here, the generate set to false means that we don't want the factory to set the property values to dummy values. Include optional fields false means that we don't want the factory to include the optional values. Here we are setting the flight ID to AE10105062018, and then we are passing the namespace, transaction type, flight ID, and options object to the new transaction function on the factory. This creates the transaction object, and in step number 5, we are setting the properties of the transaction object. We are setting the flight number, origin, destination, and the schedule. In the sixth step, we have to submit the transaction, and that we do by invoking the submit transaction function on the connection object. If everything goes fine, this message, transaction submitted successfully, will be printed on the console. I'm on the Explorer interface for the Composer REST server, and we'll check if there are any flights that already exist. And as you can see, we have an empty array which indicates that there are no flights in the registry for the flight resource. Next, I'm going to execute the code and see what happens there. So we are executing the BN factory submit transaction. Here we receive the definition from the runtime, and the transaction was submitted and processed successfully. Let's go back to our REST server and see if the flight is created. And as you can see, we have just created one flight resource by way of the create flight transaction. Let's summarize. In this lecture, I covered how you can submit a transaction to the Fabric runtime. Multiple classes need to be used for submitting a transaction. The first thing you have to do is create the connection using the business network connection class, and then call the get business network, which returns an instance of the business network definition. Then on the business network definition, you need to invoke the get factory method that returns an instance of the factory. On the factory object, you invoke the new transaction function, and that creates an instance of the resource. You would use the set property value on the resource object to set the various attributes of the resource. And then you would use the submit transaction function on the business network connection to submit the transaction to the Fabric runtime.